So remember how optimistic and encouraging I was with the first presentation for game design? Well, this presentation is exactly the opposite of that. So I hope you enjoy my incredibly pessimistic outlook of game design. But anyways, in this case, I want to talk about preparing for success and failure of making your own game by moi. So here it goes. This is the first time I'm presenting this. We're going to find out how well it goes. I'm not very well prepared. So a couple of disclaimers. So what I mean by success in this case is I mean financially self-sustaining. That's what most indie developers want, right? You want to be able to make a game that makes back both the money that it took to make your first game and money to make for the second game. So yeah, that's the criteria I'm going by. Some people in here might want to shoot for a little higher than that, but that's generally the bar that we're looking at. And number two, I am not good at following my own advice. This is a say as I do, not or do as I say, not as I do. So don't take me as a good example of this. And I'm being honest here because I'm not going to pretend that I wrote this presentation in mind thinking to myself that I regret a lot of the decisions that I made going out as an indie developer. So now I'm giving you all these failures that I went through. I'm letting you know these are the tips that I would recommend following. So let's start off with a good dose of really cold water onto your face. According to the 42matters.com, as of June 11th, 2019, which was the writing of this presentation, there is 1,331 apps, and that is new apps, by the way, being released on the Apple App Store, and 3,923 new apps on the Google Play Store. And you'll be saying, wow, that's a lot of apps. How frequent is that? That is every day. That is literally every single day that many new apps are coming out. Think about that number for a minute. All right, what about Steam then? According to Steam Spy, an average of 5.3 new games are coming out on Steam every day. And finally, according to, this one was hard to find, so apologies for the poor source here, but according to Gregman in late 2016 on an itch.io forum, an estimate of 400 new games are coming out on itch.io every single day. Like, let that sink into you. If it wasn't obvious already, the odds of success are literally against everyone. There are just so many games coming out, so many apps, so many things coming out on a daily basis that the probability of you winning is minuscule. Like, it's just a simple numbers game. The more stuff there are out there, the harder it is to make yourself self-sustaining. So, like, personally, I would recommend developing like you're already a success. Make sure you work hard on your project. Make sure you're feeling positive about it. And especially when it comes to like pitching your game and sharing your game, you want to pitch it like it's like the best thing since sliced bread, right? Always a good idea. You want to make sure that everyone is convinced that your game is worth investing in. But likewise, you also want to prepare for failure. And the two most common sources of failure that I can imagine are running out of budget, by and far the most common. Also running out of steam, but we're going to disregard that for right now. We're going to pretend that you're an amazing person that can do everything on time and everything on schedule. And the second main problem is dealing into legal problems as well. I'm skipping out the part about dealing with energy and so forth because that is a longer talk, and this is supposed to be a very short talk instead. But these two I can easily talk about, doesn't take too much time. So things I would recommend to prepare for before you start your first game is to make sure you have a stable source of income. These can come in forms such as a part-time and a full-time job. I know that's time taken away from developing your game, but if I'm to be completely honest, it is better that you already have a job when your first game fails, which, as I remind you, is a higher likeliness of it happening than, your game does not work out, it did not sell well, and you have nothing. You have nothing to return back to. I would also recommend, for legal reasons, to establish a business. I will just consult your state law to see what is the necessary steps to establish a business. But as it turns out, most locations want you to make a business. I wonder why. But yeah, most locations, any country, any sort of state would generally try to encourage and establishing a business as easy as possible. And the reason why I say this is that if you run into legal problems, it is only your business that deals with that problem, not you. The whole point of establishing a business, after all, is making it so that your business owns, a limited number of stuff, so that your stuff, like apartment, house, car, that kind of stuff, cannot be taken away from you. Will not be taken away from you if you were to get sued. If you did get sued and you personally are taking the blame from it, especially if you lose, those are some really terrible potential consequences that you may be dealing with. If your business loses, well, it's only whatever you said the business owns that loses all that sort of property right, all that sort of materials and so forth. Yes, you may lose a computer, maybe you might lose an internet connection. That is far better than losing your car, your house, everything else, right? And then finally, if more than one person is involved in your game development, which is a very common situation for a lot of video game studios, because holy crud, it's not easy to make a game by yourself, says the guy who makes a game by himself a lot of times. I would establish a lot of legal agreements between all of those team members. So things that will be a good idea to establish as part of this legal agreement include specifying who owns what, which usually when that happens, a company owns the copyrights to the materials that are being created. But also drafting, what one can do within those limitations. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're dealing with an artist. Very commonly, an artist needs to have a creative portfolio and need to show off their own artworks that they've created for other companies to show that, hey, if you're going to hire me, these are the kind of works that I do. You want to clearly draft, like, are they allowed to pull it up on there? Are they allowed to sell the artworks that they created for the game? What if the game assets end up being unused, which happens very frequently, and artists will constantly revise over and over until they get something that the game designer likes. Like, what happens to those copies? Are we allowed to do anything about that? So you want to be able to have a clear paper saying, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And finally, you want to indicate how much they're going to be earning, make it clear and obvious. Why they're going to be earning it. Is it per hour? If it's per hour, who is supposed to be filing those hours? How are we supposed to be keeping those records? So on and so forth. Because you obviously don't want to just give out money for something that, where somebody did absolutely nothing. So you want to make sure that is defined clearly. But hey, on the upshot, what if you do happen to succeed? Well, I have some bad news for that too. The consequences of success are, and this is something that I kind of heard from a few people that happen to be either into this situation or were informed of what you do when you're dealing with this kind of situation, is that the first thing is that people are going to be listening very closely to what you're saying. Oh yeah, and some of those people who are listening to you very closely, many of them are going to be allies, some of them are going to be your enemies, and a lot of them are going to be people you have never, ever, ever met in person, especially if it's going on online. So you want to be aware of that. The second thing you're going to be happening, and as one of my colleagues would describe it, you start making a lot of quote-unquote friends. These are people who will be asking money for you and or potentially become more manipulative with an intent of trying to grab money, trying to, extract money out of you. Because, hey, if they think you're a success, clearly you have enough to afford to be able to share that wealth, right? You obviously, if you're wondering why a lot of relatively rich people or people who just suddenly become successful become much more cynical about life, I think the second reason kind of explains for itself why, because they now have to deal with these incredibly sociopathic kind of people. And unfortunately, they do exist. It's just a matter of the current society that we live in. So you want to obviously prepare for these. Fortunately for preparations of success, that can kind of happen a little more later towards development. But especially if you're kind of like the person who's already well acquainted with the social media, you have a lot posted on there, I think it will be a good time to start getting some training on social media and public speaking. There are plenty of paid services for those, especially if you are already successful. There's good reasons to believe you have money to use for that specific purpose. So yes, please learn how to communicate with what you're saying. You also want to hire a community manager and or a social media expert to handle any sort of communications and PR, because my goodness, it's going to overwhelm you. I would also learn how to conduct interviews, and especially how they're being conducted. These include, for example, researching who journalists are, what websites they're coming from, and like honestly, it's a two-way street. You can ask journalists what sort of questions they want to ask, and be prepared beforehand before actually going through an interview if you need to. This is in the case where they're doing this communication in real time. Some journalists will just send you an email saying, here's the questions, can you answer these? In which case then, outside of the fact that you have to get it with a deadline that the journalist asked you for, you have all the time that you need to kind of formulate an answer. So, journalists are not scary in any sense, but they do have a specific job that they need to do, and it's going to be up to you to decide whether you want to accept that or not. You are allowed to go back to a journalist and say, sorry, we do not have a response for you, or something to that effect. I don't know what the actual legal criteria for that is, but it is entirely within your right to tell the journalist, sorry, I'm not interested in responding to your questions. And there will be, sure, they might write something bad about you, but they can't say something bad about what you said, right? So that gives you a little more control over your communication. And finally, for the people who are going to be asking you for money, I would establish a very clear policy on how an individual can request compensation or reimbursement from the company. Personally, feel free to donate money to, any sort of charitable organization that you particularly support. That's totally fine. But personally speaking, my opinion is that you're probably gonna, if you're in this position where people are gonna be walking up to you and being like, so hey, do you have money? I do not recommend giving money personally out of pocket to them. I would instead tell them, hey, look, this is the policy that we have on how to ask money from me. Please follow that, right up front. And, this policy should clearly draft an agreement that defines what the money will be used for, and whether that money is expected to be returned to the company at some point or not, right? If you don't define what the money is going to be used for, they're going to be using it for whatever. So you probably want to tell them up front, hey, look, you need to tell me what the money is being used for, and we need to go through this approval process to make sure that we agree with that usage of the money or not. You should define how the individual will be notified on whether their request has been approved, and when. And finally, when the procedure, you should make this procedure as transparent and as clear as possible, so that people are not coming back to you with more questions. So those are at least my understanding of dealing with these two very different situations at the end of your game development process. So, any questions?
So do you think it's better to go for Steam that has 5 new games a day, or Google Play that has thousands of new games a day?
Oh, in regards to which store you're shooting for. Okay, no, that's a good question. So this was an advice I was given earlier, but my understanding is that if you're going to be putting out your game to a store, the first and important problem you're going to be dealing with is getting your game out to people that can see it. There are multiple ways of dealing with that problem. Most people most indie game developers work by building up a community. But if that building up of a community strategy is not working for you prior to the release, of course, and when we talk about building up a community, that's years and years of work, by the way. But if building up a community is not going to work, then I would recommend searching for and studying for any sort of stores and trying to see if you can get in contact with the store managers themselves and see if you can come up with an agreement or some sort of way to promote your game onto their storefront, clearly. It's important to know like what store works well for what audience as well. If you're making, for example, a relatively, what's the word I'm looking for? Casual-friendly games. Yeah, technically the App Store would be a great place to sell it to. But there are also a couple of I want to say publishers, but I'm not entirely sure what best way to phrase them. There's also a couple of other stores out there that could potentially use App Store as a wrapper, but the important part is they're entirely driven around listing games for a specific audience, like casual audience. So like it's always a good idea to research on what sort of website, publishers, and markets there are that very specifically caters to your niche. At the end of the day, like what ultimately matters, what ultimately determines whether your game was successful or not, is how many people buys it, or how many people spends money on it if it's a free-to-play. So at that point, you just have to really bend the numbers game to your favor. I hope that makes sense. I'm not going, and this is a classic do as I say, not as I do, because I do this very poorly as well.
I was just wondering if this isn't too personal, if you could talk a little bit about like some expectations you had, like when you've been working on your own, especially like larger commercial games.
Yeah.
Like things you expected and then like might have been surprised by like after release, I guess, that things that didn't meet your expectations or were surprising to you after releasing a game.
This might sound naive. I was actually surprised at how long it took to get our game out, and how quickly the conversation. So for context, I was making a game called Not a Clone, which is of course a very sarcastic title about a game about clones. But I was surprised at how quickly the conversation of clones died out. And I really feel like should we have released our game more than a year sooner than when we actually released it, we would have had a much likelier success. But so like after that, the conclusion I got from it was I shouldn't try to sell a game that is designed to be reactionary to a current event. So at least for my future purposes, I'm thinking to myself that I'm not going to try to follow any sort of like recent trends, memes, news, all that sort of stuff, because by the time I finish the game, which is going to be like 3 or 4 years after, it's going to be well outdated and nobody's going to be nearly as interested. So that's something that I was kind of surprised with, but I should have kind of realized what's going to happen.
Thanks.
Yep. Oh yeah, and then like Apple is kind of strange in their approval process. There's one kind of critical aspect of our game where they rejected. I'm not going to go too far into details on this, but if you're wondering why we haven't made updates to the game after releasing it, there's a particular reason.
Just me starting out and realizing that like I'm actually want to get into game design as like a career, basically. This is why I'm actually here. My question to you is, if let's say if you're like me and you have ideas and you're an artist and it's kind of like a idea waterfall, almost in a way of like you just start that process and like one idea adds to another, adds to another, adds to another. My whole premise is I think it's like I know that I'm an artist, but at the same time, there's multiple avenues that I want to go down. So it's kind of like my question to you is, where do you start with that whole knowledge of knowing that you have ideas? You know,
That is an interesting question that I also feel is well out of the scope of this talk. But anyways, that's not the important comment here.
I mean, can I just kind of like say that like I think it's in terms of like just start somewhere. I think in a way.
The suggestion was game jams are a good place to
Game jams, okay.
test your ideas.
Yeah.
To jump on that as well, I would argue that the best place to start, because the main problem with knowing whether a game is good or not is until you actually make a version of it, you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly a very skeptical person when it comes to like the game design ideas that I have when I draft them. Like I think they're good, but I'm not entirely convinced until I actually make them. So with that in mind, my recommendation is to just make one that you happen to think is your favorite. If you cannot think of a favorite, then just start with whatever comes up first. However, here's the catch. You want to make it in such a way that it is so brutally simple. Like when you look at Jamie's games, for example, with the with dealing with the time constraints that he has, they're often using abstract art, right? So what you want is basically a demonstrable version of your game without any flourishes, without not even attempting to add sound effects. Maybe in some cases you don't even add in an end condition, or it's just a matter of things that just kind of goes on forever. The important exercise in all of this is that when you make said game, you want to make sure that it gives the experience exactly the way you wanted it to. I've had a few games that I tried to make that I thought was a really good idea, that when I ended up making a very simple prototype of it, I found was actually really terrible. Yep, and Jamie is nodding his head saying, I've been through that too. And so that is what I would recommend. Like make a super duper simple version of it. No sound, no graphics, no nothing. Just barely enough that at least you yourself think you know what you're seeing, and you can kind of envision some other player playing this and thinking to yourself, like, is this fun? Is this going to be fun for somebody else besides me? I say the word fun, but replace that with any sort of adjective, experience-related adjective in there. But yeah, no, like, does this convey the experience I'm shooting for? Is this actually interesting? And if it's not doing that, then throw it out and move on. In theory, when you're making these sort of small prototypes, it should take a very small amount of time out of you. I would recommend that if you're trying to make a prototype, that you don't spend more than a few weekends on it. Or people who obviously have a full-time job, that is. I would not spend more than a few weekends on it. If it takes more than a few weekends, it might be too much for you. And you might want to move on just because the scope is far too large for the team size that you're dealing with.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry for the downer talk.
We got both sides. Cool. Thanks, Taro.
Yep.